In a courtroom where justice should always be blind, one judge thought he could get away with mocking a woman simply because of how she looked. But he didn't know who she really was. This woman wasn't just anyone. She was about to become the most powerful person in that room. What happened next would shake that courtroom to its core. This is the story of Danielle Brooks, the woman who turned a moment of disrespect into a powerful lesson for everyone who doubted her. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video if you believe in standing up for what's right. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Let's jump right in. The courtroom was busy, buzzing with activity, as attorneys shuffled papers and clients waited anxiously for their cases to be called. The old wooden panels, the echoing footsteps, and the distant murmur of voices created an almost oppressive atmosphere. It was a typical day in the Southern courthouse, but the moment Danielle Brooks stepped through the door, everything shifted. Danielle was calm, her stride confident, but her senses sharp. She had prepared for this moment for years. This was her day. Her tailored suit fit perfectly, her posture impeccable. She was the picture of professionalism, but the eyes of everyone in the room settled on her as she moved toward the front of the courtroom. Judge Richard Harlow, a man with a reputation for arrogance and stubborn tradition, took notice immediately. He looked her up and down, a sneer curling on his lips. Without a second thought, he assumed she was just another junior assistant or paralegal sent to sit in on the case. Well, what do we have here? Judge Harlow's voice rang out, full of dismissive authority. A little late to the party, aren't we? You're in the wrong place, miss. His tone was sharp, condescending. Danielle stood frozen for a moment, but only for a second. She knew the importance of making a first impression. She took a breath and stepped forward, ready to introduce herself. But the judge interrupted her before she could speak. Why are you standing there? Not even a blazer to look the part. Shouldn't you be in the back with the rest of the assistants? The room grew still. Danielle's face remained calm, but the sting of his words settled deep within her. She tried to speak, but the judge wasn't done. The tension in the room grew thick, an invisible line drawn between the two. As Judge Harlow's dismissive words echoed in the courtroom, Danielle's mind briefly slipped back in time. The air around her shifted, and the courtroom faded, replaced by the quiet, familiar streets of her childhood neighborhood. It wasn't much, a small, rundown area where neighbors didn't speak unless absolutely necessary. The cracks in the pavement seemed to mirror the lives of those who lived here, each one filled with challenges that no one else could understand. Danielle grew up in that neighborhood, raised by a mother who was her rock. Her mother, a tireless woman with deep, warm eyes and a spirit made of iron, worked 3 jobs just to put food on the table. Each night, Danielle would watch her mom leave for another late shift at the diner or the factory, always coming home exhausted, but never complaining. Despite the exhaustion, her mom made sure Danielle knew her worth. She made sure Danielle knew she could rise above the limitations that the world tried to place on her. But the world had a different plan. In school, Danielle faced whispers behind her back, harsh words from teachers who doubted her intelligence, and classmates who ridiculed her because of where she came from. She was constantly labeled as the girl who'd never make it, as if her neighborhood, her skin color, and her family were the sole measure of her potential. At times, it was hard to keep pushing forward, when it felt like every door was slammed in her face. But Danielle never gave up. She poured herself into her studies, not just to prove them wrong, but because she knew that her dreams meant more than the cruelty she faced. In college, things didn't get easier. Professors looked past her, assuming she wouldn't last in law school. But Danielle fought harder. She graduated at the top of her class, earning respect and recognition from those who had once doubted her. Her reputation as a fierce, fair, and brilliant attorney quickly grew, and soon she was known as one of the best in the field. Just days ago, the news broke that Danielle had been appointed as the first Black female Chief Justice in the state, a title she had fought tirelessly for. It was an achievement few could have imagined for a girl from a poor neighborhood, but for Danielle, It was simply the next step on a journey of defying the odds. The air in the courtroom grew thicker with every passing second. Danielle stood unmoved, her posture straight and composed, but inside, a storm raged. Judge Harlow, meanwhile, continued to belittle her without hesitation, his voice dripping with disdain. "Let me guess," the judge sneered. "You're here because of some quota, aren't you? Affirmative action at work, I presume." He chuckled under his breath, as if the joke was somehow clever, his eyes scanning the room for approval. The courtroom was silent, but not everyone was comfortable. Some of the attorneys exchanged uneasy glances, but most just sat still, pretending not to notice the insult. The few who shifted uncomfortably seemed too afraid to speak up, while others silently nodded, as if agreeing with the judge's rude assumptions. Danielle's heart pounded, but she held her ground. She could feel the eyes on her, the weight of their judgment, some sympathetic, some cold, but it didn't matter. She wasn't there for them. She was there for justice. And for herself. "Why don't you sit down in the gallery, where you belong, miss?" Judge Harlow said, waving a hand dismissively toward the back of the room. "You're clearly out of your depth." The words stung, but Danielle didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "May I speak, Your Honor?" Before the judge could respond, the bailiff took a step forward, his expression one of concern. "Judge, I think," but Judge Harlow waved him off, his irritation clear. "Stay out of this, Bailey," he snapped. "This doesn't concern you." Danielle's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. She would not let this man silence her. Not today. The tension in the courtroom seemed to reach its breaking point when a courtroom officer stepped into the room, a manila folder in his hands. He moved quietly, but with a purpose, walking toward the bench where Judge Harlow was still trying to compose himself after mocking Danielle. The officer handed the folder to the judge, who glanced up, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What's this?" he muttered, still caught in the bitterness of his earlier words. Without a second thought, he tore open the envelope and began reading the contents. As his eyes scanned the page, his expression shifted, his smirk faltered, and for the first time, there was hesitation in his posture. The courtroom, which had been tense and awkward, seemed to hold its collective breath. The judge's fingers trembled slightly as he continued to read, his face growing pale. Danielle remained still, her gaze steady, as she watched him. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence, and even the murmurs of the spectators ceased. Finally, the judge looked up, his voice faltering as he stammered, What is this?" He cleared his throat and forced himself to finish reading aloud, though his voice shook with disbelief. "This is a directive from the governor's office, introducing Danielle Brooks as the new Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. She's here today, as part of her first official duties, to observe court proceedings." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, like an electric shock. The collective shock was palpable, and a few of the attorneys exchanged stunned looks. The atmosphere shifted from one of mockery to utter disbelief. The room felt suffocating, the weight of the moment heavy on everyone present. Judge Harlow's face drained of color. His mouth moved, but no words came out. He blinked, trying to process what he had just read. His eyes darted from the paper to Danielle and back again, unable to grasp the reality of the situation. Danielle's expression remained calm, though her eyes held a quiet satisfaction. She had earned this moment, and despite the judge's attempt to belittle her, it was clear who held the power in that room now. The silence that followed, Judge Harlow's stunned reaction, felt heavy in the air, but Danielle knew this was her moment. With measured steps, she walked calmly to the bench, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Every eye in the courtroom was on her, the weight of the moment undeniable. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone commanded attention. She stood before the judge, who still looked pale and uncertain, his hands gripping the papers from the governor's office. The courtroom had fallen completely silent, almost as if the walls themselves were listening. Danielle took a deep breath, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the room. "Good afternoon," she began, her words cutting through the tense air. "I'm Chief Justice Danielle Brooks, and I'm here today, not just as a title, but as someone who believes in fairness, dignity, and equality. I'm here because it's time for the justice system to reflect the values we all claim to hold dear." She paused for a moment, her eyes sweeping over the room. It wasn't just the judge she was addressing, it was everyone in that room. Every person who had ever doubted her, every person who had tried to make her feel small. "You see, I didn't get here because of a quota or an affirmative action policy. I got here because I fought every day for the right to be seen and heard. I grew up in a neighborhood where dreams were crushed before they even began, but I never let anyone define me by my circumstances or my skin color, and I won't let anyone define the people who come after me either." Her voice softened for a moment, but the fire in her eyes never wavered. "I stand here today, not only for myself, but for every person who has ever been underestimated or dismissed. I won't let people, like Judge Harlow, make others feel as though they don't belong. I will fight for every person who's been told they're not enough." The courtroom was still, many faces now filled with emotion. A few of the spectators had tears in their eyes, the weight of her words striking deep. Danielle nodded slowly, her voice firm as she concluded, "I am grateful to those who believed in me, who stood by me when the world tried to push me down. This is just the beginning." The days following the courtroom revelation were a whirlwind, but Danielle remained focused on the bigger picture. She didn't seek revenge against Judge Harlow. She sought accountability. A formal complaint was filed, detailing his behavior, his mockery, his disrespect, and his assumption that she was anything less than qualified. The complaint quickly reached the governor's office, and the legal community began to take notice. It didn't take long for the consequences to follow. Judge Harlow, once known for his arrogance and unwavering confidence, was placed on temporary leave pending a full investigation into his conduct. His reputation, so carefully built over the years, now hung in the balance. Danielle didn't celebrate the judge's downfall. Instead, she spoke of fairness. "This is not about me winning," she said in an interview. "It's about ensuring that justice is not just a word, but a practice. We cannot allow anyone in this system to degrade or undermine the people they are meant to serve." While the investigation played out, Danielle continued her work as Chief Justice. She visited courthouses across the state, checking in on the proceedings, ensuring that everyone, no matter their race, gender, or background, was treated with dignity and respect. Her message was clear: fairness had to be more than a policy. It had to be a commitment from every judge, every court official, every person in the legal system. As the months went by, the legal community began to see Danielle's influence taking hold. Her quiet triumph wasn't just in her position, but in her steadfast commitment to a justice system that worked for everyone, regardless of where they came from or who they were. In a small living room, a young girl sat on the edge of a couch, her eyes wide as she watched the television. The image of Danielle Brooks, standing tall in her Chief Justice robes, filled the screen. The girl's mouth was open in awe, and her heart raced with excitement. "Mom," she said softly, her voice full of wonder, "I want to be like her one day." Her mother, who had been folding laundry nearby, turned toward her daughter. The words caught in her throat, and her eyes welled with tears. She smiled gently, her hands pausing in mid-motion. "You can be anything you want, sweetheart. If you work hard, believe in yourself, and never let anyone tell you that you can't, you can be just like her, and even more." The young girl's eyes sparkled with wonder, as if the world had just opened up to her in a way she'd never imagined. She sat forward, her small hands gripping the edges of the couch, as the image of Danielle Brooks filled the screen. The pride, the strength, the quiet power radiating from the woman on TV made her heart race. She looked at her mom, her voice soft but full of hope. "Mom, I want to be like her one day," she said, her words a promise to herself, a dream she hadn't fully realized yet, but felt deep in her soul. Her mother, standing nearby, paused her work. The room was quiet for a moment, as she turned, looking at her daughter, with a smile that spoke volumes. Tears welled up in her eyes as she saw her little girl's excitement, knowing how deeply this moment would shape her. This was more than admiration. It was a shift in what was possible for her daughter. She walked over, kneeling beside her, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You can be anything you want, sweetheart. If you work hard, if you believe in yourself, and if you never let anyone tell you that you can't, then you can be just like her, even more," the mother said, her voice breaking with emotion. The young girl's face lit up with renewed determination. She nodded slowly, her eyes sparkling with new possibilities. "I will," she whispered to herself, her heart full of conviction. She didn't know how or when, but she knew now that she could be like Danielle, someone who had risen above, who had faced challenges and refused to be stopped. She would make her dreams real, just like the woman on TV. Meanwhile, high in her office, Danielle Brooks sat at her desk, finishing up her day's work. Though her to-do list was long, her mind wandered to something deeper. She looked out the large window at the courthouse below, watching as the city bustled with life. People walked hurriedly through the streets, some in suits, others in work uniforms, all going about their business. But in that moment, none of them knew the weight she carried, the responsibility of being the first Black woman to hold the position of Chief Justice. The sense of fulfillment washed over her like a quiet tide. It wasn't just about the job, the title, or the respect she had earned. It was about something much larger. She wasn't just sitting behind this desk for herself. She was here for everyone who had been overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. She was here for every person who hadn't been given the chance to show their worth. She was here for the people who needed to see that change was possible, that they too could rise. Danielle let out a slow breath, taking a moment to savor the feeling of purpose that filled her. This wasn't the end of her journey, it was just the beginning. The work, the struggles, the efforts to make the system just and fair, it was all just starting. But in that moment, she understood something deeply. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever felt small, for every person who had ever been told they couldn't. Her smile was soft, but it held all the pride and hope of someone who knew the true power of representation. She wasn't smiling for herself. She was smiling for all the young girls, for all the people who needed to see someone like them rise to the top. She smiled because she knew that for many, her story had already sparked the fire of a dream they didn't know was possible. Her work had just begun, but for the first time in her life, she felt the weight of it was worth every moment. And just like that, Danielle Brooks changed the course of history, not through revenge or anger, but through grace, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Her story is a reminder that the power of one person, standing firm in their truth, can challenge the system and inspire countless others to do the same. From the moment she stepped into that courtroom, Danielle showed the world what real leadership looks like. She didn't seek recognition, she sought fairness. She didn't let the words of one man define her worth. And in doing so, she became a symbol of hope for those who need it most. Her victory wasn't just in the courtroom that day, it was in every young person, especially young girls of color, who saw her and thought, "I can do that too." It's a new day in the fight for equality, and Danielle is leading the charge. If Danielle's journey inspired you, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. Let's spread her story of perseverance, courage, and hope. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for more incredible stories that will motivate and empower you. Remember, justice isn't just a word, it's a fight. And like Danielle, we all have the power to make a difference. Keep pushing forward, no matter the obstacles. Thank you for watching.